Well, next month, we'll all see new rules on who is responsible for credit card fraud when it happens. Cyber thieves stole nearly $8 billion last year alone. Beginning in October, all retailers and banks will assume liability from the consumer when they switch over to credit cards equipped with one of those smart chips. Retailers now must update their payment processing systems to accept these kinds of credit cards. To get a better handle on how this affects those of us who use credit cards and debit cards, pretty much all of us, we're joined now by security expert Carolyn Balfany, Senior Vice President at Mastercard. Carolyn, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, under these new security rules, fraud liability falls on the banks and the real retailer. Who was responsible before this big change?
Typically, the issuer of the card or the bank has been responsible for the fraud.
So not necessarily the consumer. What's the big change here, though? What's the big difference?
The change is that as of October 1st, whichever entity doesn't upgrade to chip cards or chip terminals will be responsible for the fraud going forward. So if your bank doesn't issue a chip card to you, then they'll be responsible for the fraud. And similarly, if the merchant doesn't upgrade their terminals to be able to do chip transactions, they'll be responsible for the fraud. And really, this is all geared toward creating incentive for both the banks to issue cards and the merchants to upgrade the terminals so that we create a more secure environment.
And that's a big concern these days. Now, big retailers like Walmart and Target are already accommodating these smart chip transactions. But what about the smaller businesses, those types of retailers? What happens if they don't switch by the deadline?
If they don't switch, they will be responsible for the fraud. Now, that's more or less important depending on your business. For a local dry cleaner, maybe that's less important right away. But eventually, they'll all change over and upgrade to chip. We think that'll take about 2 years.
Okay, so we got a little bit of a time before we see this huge change. Now, the current cards still have those magnetic strips on the back of them. That's supposedly a vulnerability there. Do you expect those magnetic strips to eventually disappear?
Eventually they will. So for right now, they'll stay on the cards because we want consumers to be able to transact everywhere they do today, and so that'll facilitate the transition. But eventually we can imagine removing the magnetic stripes completely.
All right, so big changes ahead, perhaps. Well, cybersecurity consultant Teresa Payton said this on the Today Show. Let's take a listen.
Cyber criminals always catch up and try and figure out a way around the technology, so it will be for a short period of time, but we need to be thinking about what are we going to do next when they figure out how to spoof that at the terminal.
So that's one of the problems here. The criminals always seem to eventually get one step ahead. How long do you think this type of protection, this type of technology is going to last and make things a little bit more safe before the cyber thieves figure it out?
Well, so a couple of things. One, chip technology has been really successful in many other markets around the world for better than a decade, and so it has a great track record of not being broken. Having said that, security is always about a series of and statements rather than or. So when we think about security, we don't think about a single solution, we think about layering solutions. And so I will agree that it's not a destination. We've got to keep combining and intersecting solutions intelligently to stay ahead of the fraudsters.
It's so true. I mean, there are very few people these days who have not had some sort of credit card fraud or debit card fraud happen to them. It happened to me recently. When I called my bank, the first thing they did, they said, we're going to send you one of these new cards with a little smart chip in it. So everybody's going to get one eventually. Carolyn Balfany, thanks so much for being with us, right. VP at Mastercard.
Thank you.
All right, more ahead after this.